For more on the election and the issues on the minds of voters, we welcome Frank Guridy to the studio with us. Hello, sir. You are an American historian as well as a professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. Thanks for taking some time to be with us here
Thanks
on
for having
France
me.
24. Trump has very openly courted Black and Latino men in the run-up to this election. He's counting on even a small percentage of them to defect from the Democratic Party and help him win. Is there something about Trump that is attracting Black and Latino men?
You know, I suppose there might be. I guess, some are attracted to his particular masculinist brand of politics, right? His sort of, like doubling down on the ways in which men need to assert their authority, all men, for sure. I do think it's a bit inflated, though. I think that some of this discussion of him making inroads among Black men and Latino men is somewhat exaggerated because at the end of the day, I suspect, I think most pollsters suspect that the vast majority of Latinos will vote and Black men will vote for the Democrat, right? Certainly Black men, absolutely, right? So I think that, on the one hand, we've seen him be successful courting sort of very public celebrity men, for sure, athletes in particular, right? Athletes of color, for sure. But I'm not entirely convinced that he's going to be able to make the substantial inroads that I think some people are suggesting.
We are seeing, though, about a 10% drop. About 90% of Black voters voted for Biden last time. Yeah. We're seeing 78 to 80% saying they will vote for Harris this time. So there is something, but is it more, you think, a disenchantment with the Democratic Party? Trump says, the Democrats have done nothing for you. You need to vote for me.
He's not entirely wrong about that. I think that, and I think we see this with the Harris campaign since she got the nomination, where there was enormous enthusiasm for her at first and enthusiasm for her as a Black woman, as an Asian American woman running for office. But I think some of that enthusiasm waned because it's not clear, what Black voters or what voters of color are going to get, other than the fact that she's not Donald Trump. And that's certainly significant, right? I mean, we hear her phrase all the time, we're not going back. I think the question is, are we going forward? And how are we going to go forward, right? Aside from making sure that we don't have a fascist in the White House. And I think that, I think certainly for young voters of color, I think in particular, where certain other issues like climate are really important, social welfare issues, really important. And there isn't a whole lot from the Harris campaign on that front, other than the fact presenting themselves an alternative, to Trump.
Mm-hmm. I've heard some Black men in interviews also talk about how they're uncomfortable with Harris because she was a prosecutor. Yeah. Black men in particular, it's a population that has not historically been treated very fairly by the U.S. justice system. Do you think that that prosecutor background is a big negative for her?
I think among some voters, yes. But I would frame that as, what have the Democrats done since 2020 and since the upsurge around the Black Lives Matter movement and police violence against Black people? And I would say, most Democrats have retreated on any sort of notion of police reform, right? So I do think that's true that her prosecutor background doesn't help her in that sense. I don't know that that's an issue particular to Black men. I do think that's an issue particular to all Black people who are concerned about police violence against Black people.
Mm-hmm. You're also an expert on the intersection of sports and politics, so I have a couple of questions about that for you as well. First is the debate over trans athletes in sports, specifically with the election. More than 41% of Donald Trump's TV ads have been anti-trans ads, and one of the focuses in them is trans women and girls playing sports. These ads run during major sporting events in the U.S., like the World Series. Who is Trump trying to reach exactly with these ads, and is it effective?
I think that's a great question. I can't imagine this being a substantive issue aside from his base, right? So I think, so much of his campaign is less about convincing voters to vote for him and more about, galvanizing his base around so-called culture war issues like trans athletes, like, systemic racism and immigration and things like that, right? So, certainly, the United States is in a moment of transition with respect to trans identity. And I think that what we've seen historically is that when issues like this of sexuality emerge in the culture, there's a pushback against that. And I think so he's picking that as a way to, sort of assure his base. I don't think this is a substantive issue among most voters.
Right. I mean, polling shows that it isn't, but it sounds like perhaps this is a way to throw some some red meat to his base voters, but not really expand the map.
Exactly. If you look at his rally in the Madison Square Garden a couple of weeks ago, that certainly isn't about trying to win New York, right? It's about staging, right, his sort of vision of American society for his base, right, and for those who are, galvanized around racism and immigration issues and others.
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to ask you about the role of sports celebrities in politics. We have seen lots of athletes come out in support of both candidates, basketball stars, LeBron James, Steph Curry, for Harris. Former pro wrestler Hulk Hogan has been a huge figure in Trump's campaign. Also, boxing legend Mike Tyson has been a prominent supporter. What kind of impact can these athletes make on voters?
We've seen evidence that they can make an impact. I think they definitely did in 2020 for sure, right? Especially WNBA athletes and galvanizing voter support for the Atlanta Senate, the Georgia Senate race in 2020. They had a substantial impact in that election. So I do think they do affect voters for sure, particularly young voters who see these people as cultural figures beyond the fact that they are excellent athletes. So I do think they have a substantive impact. I think that their impact is really push when there's a movement pushing them, and I think that's what we've seen historically speaking. Whether it was the 1960s, people rallying around civil rights, around Muhammad Ali, for example, or in 2020 when the black athletes are standing against police violence. I mean, when there's a movement pushing them along, I think that's when they're more impactful. Mm-hmm. This year, it's hard to say if that's happening, actually. In some ways, it doesn't seem like it is.
Do you see that there's less of a negative effect for the athletes themselves? For a long time, it was stick to sports. What's the famous quote? Shut up and dribble. Shut up and dribble, right. Exactly. Right. But is it not so alienating? Are athletes not so worried about alienating voters by coming out with their political beliefs?
I think the trend suggests that it's not as that they're not as worried about that anymore. I mean, certainly, if you're a celebrity and you have a stature, not just sports celebrities or Taylor Swift or somebody like that, for sure. But I think for the established stars, I think they're more willing to speak out, politically and speak out for justice. And I think that's a trend we've seen over the last several years.
Frank Guridy, thank you so much for joining us here on France 24. Really interesting to get your perspective on this race.
Let's see where we'll be. Thank you for having me.
Great to talk to you. And of course, we will have plenty of in-depth coverage on the U.S. elections, kicking off tomorrow, Tuesday at 7 p.m. Paris time. That's 1 p.m. in Washington. Do be sure to join us.